This is a fine and unusual classroom situation for me. I've taught in auditorium situations, but I never had a jury box in back of me, and it gives me an idea, or at least students ought to revolt and have all classes. You probably heard this one before, but have all classes in this kind of format, and you can have a jury there, and if the professor doesn't give a reasonable lecture, he should be taken out and given 30 days or hung or whatever you're going to do with him, or just taken out. But in any event, I'm pleased to be here, and I'd like to share with you my research, writing, and experience, specifically with regard to violent gangs. And this is the paperback edition of a book I wrote some years ago called The Violent Gang. I'm now in the process of revising this book. I'll just give it another minute or two till these people get settled. There are seats up front here, so. And then we'll just close the door, and that'll be it. Why don't you just close the door and feel like I'm in the Grand Central Terminal. Okay. All right. For openers, the term gang has been thrown around considerably, and certainly in the press and even in sociological literature where efforts have been made to analyze what a gang is. We have a variety of different types of configurations of gangs. For example, the most early study of Thrasher back in the 30s, where the subtitle of his book is 1,301 Gangs, I believe it is, in Chicago. These tended to be more cohesive, coherent units. Another notable example in the gang literature is a book called Street Corner Society by William White, which was done in Boston, where he spent a lot of time on the corner with a group of individuals who hung out with each other. And there was a certain actual comradeship about those groups. If we move into the 50s, 60s, and to current gangs, you have a panorama of different kinds of structures, different kinds of motivations, different kinds of meaning when you use the term gang. For example, in the press, they'll often refer to what they call a gang-related homicide. And having spent 40 years studying gangs, this is totally irrelevant to me. I don't know what that means. It may have been some psychopathic individual who murdered someone in an argument over some petty issue, and use the cloak of immunity of the gang. In other words, to some extent, if you think about violent gangs, which is the subject of most of my work, with regard to gangs. It's a cloak of immunity for individuals who are emotionally disordered to commit all sorts of horrendous and atrocious acts. For example, in my efforts to analyze so-called drive-by killings, it can be something where actually 3 or 4 individuals jump into a car and they go to another gang neighborhood and they're going to kill somebody over there because some of their homeboys were harmed in some way. On the other hand, it could be some kind of maniacal individual on a Saturday night who's loaded and has 2 or 3 cohorts, and they jump in the car and they happen to have an AK-47, and they blow somebody away, or they're not very good shots, and sometimes they'll hit a 4-year-old kid or somebody's grandmother in the backyard when they're having a picnic. So it is quite a melange. So the first point I want to make in terms of defining what a gang is, we have to start thinking in those terms, that a gang is not a homogeneous phenomenon in American society. I'm not just talking about, say, Dallas or Houston or LA or New York. There are a lot of differences. And we've really scratched the surface in terms of doing research with gangs. Recently, for the last 3 years, I've been working in a prison down around San Diego in California, and this I'll be talking about later this afternoon. There is a therapeutic community there, and there are 200 of the inmates in a prison with 5,000 inmates who are in for everything from drug dealing to murder. 200 of them are in a special program, and within this program, I work regularly with so-called Crips and Bloods, and because these guys are in a therapeutic process, they're really much more open about their feelings, their behavior, and you can, within that context, you can learn a lot more about the structure of gangs. And one of the kind of ultimate insanities of gangs, which are dominantly, although there's some middle-class gangs, minority group individuals, basically African-American Crips and Bloods and so-called Mexican Mafia, which I understand functions in, I mean, you're happy to have them in your Texas prisons also. And I've explored with them, you know, and I won't use the language I use within that context, but we talk pretty openly in groups about gangs, you know, and here will be a young black man around 22 years old, and here's another young black man. They're both victims of a kind of poverty and a depressed socioeconomic situation and a sense of hopelessness about their future, and here they are in prison doing 5 to 10 years, and one's a Crip and one's a Blood. And in terms of social psychological characteristics, they are brothers, but they've been killing each other. And the question arises, and I wish I had a clearer answer because I get a kind of muffled answer. Why are you guys killing each other? The only thing I can come up with is that there's a certain kind of self-hatred, there's a feeling of despair, a feeling that there's no future in their life, and the gang, in simplistic terms, doesn't become a family, which I think one word I can use, you know, they don't become a family, that's kind of bullshit. It becomes a power structure for individuals who feel powerless and who feel that they are not fully men. I mean, everybody watches television. These guys see people working in banks and in corporate entities and students and so forth, and they feel that a lot of these roles are inaccessible to them. So what they do is they don't create a family and most of them come from so-called dysfunctional families, they create a power structure which creates what I would refer to as a macho psychosis. There's the language is power-ridden, my homeboys, and there's I can't do it because I'm an old white man. But there's a walk in prison. You can see them down the streets in South Central and probably in Houston and so forth. And it's a real aggressive, don't give me a bad look or I'll blow you away. And so there's a super masculine kind of what I would call psychosis, which emerges with individuals in the violent gang. And basically, to try to delineate some of this more specifically, I have identified 4 types of gangs. One is a kind of social gang, and some of you may have belonged to such groups. There may have been some violent behavior or some craziness at times, but most adolescents gravitate towards some kind of a group phenomenon. In high schools, you have or at least this is the way it was in California, the socias and the stoners, and there are different groups, and there's a certain coherence to them, and they're not really gangs. And in fact, there's kind of an idiotic, in my view, movement towards not allowing gang clothes to be worn in high schools. Well, a lot of nice kids who are not in gangs or violent or using drugs see this as a new style. And if you look, for example, in LA Magazine, you'll see an issue on gang clothes, which some entrepreneur is making a lot of money off of, real baggy pants and so forth. So gang clothes does not make a gang member. And there are these social gangs. There are jackets which are worn and so forth. A second type of gang is a delinquent gang. In my taxonomy of gangs, and delinquent gangs are young people who get together for the purpose of robbing, mugging, burglarizing. There's a profit orientation. And this type of structure is a lot more coherent, because if you're going to commit a burglary or a robbery or something, you need to know the other individual more specifically, and it has more cohesion. Then there's the violent gang, which is the subject basically of our session this morning. And the violent gang is not as coherent or cohesive as these other gangs. The fourth gang, which I'll talk a little bit more about, is what I would refer to as the drug dealing gang. And here there's a lot of misconceptions that, for example, the notorious Crips and Bloods now have branches in Houston, Dallas, Portland, Oregon, Chicago, and so forth and so on. And it has nothing to do with the psychosis of the violent gang. The individuals who are in these other cities, they're occasionally, some kid will try to recreate what he knew in South Central LA in some other city, and sometimes it takes hold and so forth. But for the most part, and here I find the FBI of all agencies really having misconceptions about the spread of the Crips and Bloods. These are the more intelligent gang members, they may have been former violent gang members, who are out to make a lot of money. And they're organized, and they're involved with the drug trafficking and with the importation of drugs into the country and so forth. And They are effective units. When you compare that kind of behavior with I say this directly to the gang guys, Crips, Bloods, and whatever. You guys are out of your fucking minds. Why are you shooting each other? What are you getting out of this? What does it mean? Now, if somebody's being shot because $50,000 is on the line related to some kind of drug deal, this is comprehensible, and it's a different kind of constellation. So, but the violent gang is more, in many respects, what I would consider a social psychological effort to have some status in a world where the individual feels he has no status, his life has no meaning, and it's kind of a social narcotic. It's something the individual does to give himself a feeling of self-worth in a highly destructive, bizarre way. And within the framework of the violent gang, you do have a lot of emotionally disturbed individuals. My early work with gangs was roughly in the early 50s in New York City. And one of the guys I remember who was a 24-hour gang man who is kind of a prototype, he happened to be 23 years old and was a member of the so-called West Side Dragons. And his name was, I don't know where he is now, he's probably dead. His name was, so I don't mind using his real name, was Frankie Cruz. They used to call him Loco. And he would walk up and down the west side of Manhattan talking about gangs and who's going to get whom and whatever. He had a job for a brief period of time in a hospital emergency room where he cleaned up the blood, and he loved his work. He was kind of a prototype of the violent gang individual. And his group had really limited coherence to it. There was just a lot of underlying rage among a large segment of that population. A lot of Puerto Rican kids, a lot of African American youths, and so forth. And the rage would be filtered into the gang behavior. Another characteristic of some of the violent gang behavior was what I would call existential validation. Kind of a cumbersome term, but what I mean by it is that a lot of these individuals were bored with life because they were boring people, really. And they were looking for some validation of their existence, some feeling. So most of us can, sit in a classroom and learn something or read a book or go to a film, and we can relate to this, and we are validating the fact that we are here, whereas these individuals require kind of a super emotional experience. Stabbing someone. I remember in my book, The Violent Gang, and interviewing one kid talking about how great it felt when he stabbed this kid. And I said, well, what did you do then? He says, I stabbed him again, and he looked at me like I was nuts because he was enjoying it. So that there is this intense extremist behavior. Another phenomenon of the violent gang is what I would refer to as a paranoid pseudo-community. This is a theory of a psychologist whose name escapes me at the moment. But there's a constant sense of other guys are out to get me. And this pervades the thinking of the violent gang, so that they're always talking about warfare and who's going to get whom and who's going to take over which territory and so forth. And the whole business of turf and territory is also, in many respects, sheer nonsense. And yet the press says, we'll describe a gang murder, that this guy went into this guy's turf. These gang kids own absolutely nothing. So they do exaggerate a sense of their turf or territory belonging to them, but in reality, they have nothing. To go back to the issue of camaraderie, for the last 10 years, I've worked in various psychiatric hospitals with adolescents. And in particular, I remember a girl named Brenda. I'll use the name Brenda because that's her name. And she was talking about how wonderful it was to be accepted by this gang in South Central. She happened to be white. And her homeboys and people, her friends and so forth and so on. And when we began to explore her situation, she was repeatedly raped over a period of several months, totally exploited in every way. And this poor young woman had such a need for some kind of attention that she believed that she was part of this group. And there are a lot of young people who have this feeling, and the gang tends to supply this. Again, to go back to the concept of the super macho phenomenon, or what I would call macho psychosis, the gang becomes a vehicle through which the individual has some sense of super masculinity, when in fact, in terms of the overall social system, he is at the bottom of the stratification system, and has a considerable amount of hopelessness about his position. Now, I can't go into real detail about it, but in my book, I developed a theory of what I referred to as a near group. So over here, let's say whatever a social group is within the framework of our field of sociology, there is identification as to who is a member. For example, most of you, I'm sure, have identification cards that you are either faculty or students here, so you belong. There are different departments. There's a definition of the roles which exist and so forth. And this is what is true of social groups, and I would put social gangs within this context. There's some definition of identity and individuals who know each other and some kind of common purpose of the group. At the opposite extreme, we have a mob phenomenon. Let's say, I guess, well, let's see, Dallas is playing Houston Sunday, or Dallas took a beating last week, as you probably know, or some of you know. And there might have been an eruption in the stands, but this would be anonymous people, or most of us have been at some kind of high school game where when your team lost, there was some violence which took place. And these are individuals who have no special identity but are part of an incoherent mob activity. Another mob activity that comes to my mind in last year, the Reginald Denny trial involving an individual named Damian Williams, who was a former gang member, where at the corner of Florence and Normandy in L.A. there was a riot. And this was a mob situation. It wasn't a gang activity. It wasn't any political group that was acting. So what I see, the violent gang is a kind of near group. And for example, in my research in New York with gangs, and I'm not faulting the police on this because they're real busy, and I had access to the 24th precinct, which was the area I worked in, roughly between 110th Street in New York and 145th Street, and we had a lot of different gangs in the area, the vultures, the villains, the dragons, and so forth. The dragons were like the early version of the Crips, you know, that there was a shoreline. Now there's a shoreline Crips in Venice, California. They're different configurations. There were the Uptown Dragons, the Bronx, and so there were auxiliaries. And so I had access to the police files, which were, I must say, useless. They had reports on file of different individuals, some of whom had died, some of whom were doing time up at Sing Sing, and they were operating on this basis because in the violent gang and in the near group there's a certain amount of flux and change which is almost constantly taking place. And yet the press and the courts, and to a large extent the police, see them as solidified units with certain kinds of membership phenomena. I remember there was a very, very bad gang movie some time ago where the costume designer must have been very happy, but he had a group of gangs who they all wore baseball uniforms. Some of you may know the name of this. The Warriors, right. And some wore other kinds of things. They're not that organized. They don't, and they'd be stupid to wear jackets. Now we hear about colors, blue for Crips and red for Bloods, and this is probably true. But a lot of people wear blue and red, and I remember in the earlier gang wars, there was a kid in the neighborhood up on Morningside Heights where I directed this program, and he was arrested during a gang war, which I must say was a monstrous event. And I remember being right in the middle of it, and there were probably about 600 kids roaming around. There were fights breaking out, and this all was taking place at Grant's Tomb on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. There were police cars coming in and so forth. And it wasn't two gangs, identifiable gangs who were fighting each other. What was going on was a lot of individuals expressing a lot of rage about their, if you'll pardon the sociological analysis, their socioeconomic position in the society and their sense of hopelessness. And the gang was a vehicle through which this was expressed. None of them were card-carrying members of a particular gang or had although in certain areas there are some tattoos which indicate this. But in any event, this one kid was arrested, and I happened to be down at the 24th precinct at the time. And I said, hey man, what are you doing here? You don't hang, he wasn't hanging with any gangs or whatever. Of course the police didn't believe him, because he was right there. So I said, well, you were carrying a knife. Why were you carrying a knife? He says, well, I heard about this rumble, and I'm not going to go unprotected. So he had a knife with him. But he really was not a member of any specific gang. So this notion is one that I have developed in my book. And the other aspect of it is what I would put three concentric circles about the near group violent gang that there are core members, there are marginal members, and there are peripheral. And the core individuals who are regrettably afflicted with what again I would call this macho psychosis or gang psychosis, because I see it as an emotional disorder. There's very little you can do with them in the open community. But these individuals who are more peripheral and marginal can be attracted into other activities. And in the process of my work with gangs in New York, we had basketball and baseball leagues, and we never got these guys, and they're not particularly good. Most of them weren't particularly good athletes anyway. But we would be able to attract these individuals into these activities and reduce the lethal nature of the gang. We also had an organization called AYA, which was the Adult Youth Association, so that responsible members of the community, adults who had grown up in the community up there in West Harlem, east on the Upper West Side, became part of our organization, and we were working with gangs, with gang kids, and so forth. So this was reasonably effective. Time is running on, and I'd be delighted to try to answer any questions or comments that anybody has. Yes, sir, in the back. Yeah. Well, I totally agree with your kind of assertion and question. For example, we're sitting here in the Criminal Justice University. Just think for a moment if somehow crime and violent gangs and all were eliminated, it would devastate the entertainment industry. I mean, they'd be dealing with the psychological problems of relationships or something. If there was no crime, or drug abuse, or drug dealing, or any, we might have to look at the boring, tedious behavior of politicians or something like that. So certainly, it's the entertainment industry has elevated it, and it's very consumed with gangs. And one of the best movies on gangs, which was partially based on my book, obviously I would think it was one of the best. It was done some time ago, called The Young Savages, with Burt Lancaster and, of all people, Shelley Winters. And it really portrayed some of the realities of violent gang behavior. The West Side Story is totally irrelevant to the reality of gangs, and I never met a gang kid who could dance like that or sing that well either. But that's the image a lot of people have, and that's.
But do you feel that the gang members often mimic the entertainment business in reverse?
Well, I don't think they pay a lot of attention to it. They go to movies and so forth and so on. But the closest I would say was about after the riots in L.A., there were a number of gang members who became peacemakers, and Ted Koppel fell in love with them, and they were on Nightline, and they were starting some T-shirt businesses and so forth. But I think I remember one of these guys got killed recently in a gunfight. So I don't know how much that. But there is a connection between the popular image of what gangs are. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about gun availability and perhaps the difference between
Yeah, I'll take a totally unpopular position here. I'm total advocate of extremist gun control. I would go to the point of view of having some of you poor devils who wouldn't know what to do, because you couldn't hunt. It'd be very unfortunate for you, but that's the way it would go. But looking at gangs over a span of 40 years, as I have, in the earlier years, as I was mentioning earlier today, you had a lot of stabbings, you had a lot of physical violence, which was not necessarily totally lethal. By totally lethal, I mean somebody killing someone. There would be a lot of fist fights. There would be a lot of one-on-ones. And there was the famous, it ought to be in some historic museum, the famous zip gun, which is no longer a necessity in the early 50s, post-World War II. Enterprising young men in manual training classes would get a pipe and a piece of wood, and they were supposed to be making a cabinet or a purse for their mother. No, I don't. And they would make a zip gun, which, when shot, might shoot him or blow up in his hand or kill somebody over there. They had no accuracy whatsoever that I recall, unless at very close range, where they might both get blown up by the bullet. Now we have, as you well know, Uzis and AK-47s, all kinds of assault weapons. We have the automobile, certainly in Los Angeles, which is an automobile culture. And you didn't have drive-bys in those early gang days either. Now you have the drive-bys, and so it's a much more lethal phenomenon than it used to be. Yes, sir, man in the back.
Okay, I have two questions. You talked about these ideas of rage, hopelessness, low socioeconomic conditions, single mother house, etc., about gang members. Why don't the majority of these minorities who live in these depressed areas join gangs and instead become productive members of society?
Why don't they? Yes. Well, for a lot of the reasons that I've mentioned, or that you've just mentioned. An individual sees the gang as kind of a vehicle for some kind of trust with another person, relating to another person. This isn't to say that some individuals who come from more functional families don't become involved, but I think they're less likely to become involved than the more alienated individual. I mean, in gross terms, one of the characteristics about violent gangs is summarized in the term alienation. And just, for example, what we've been doing and what we are doing is putting these individuals in prison, where, by the way, in prison, gang membership becomes more defined because it's a matter of survival and you're living in close quarters. But it doesn't do much for modifying the individual's gang orientation. What we have to do in very general terms is bring these youngsters into the mainstream of society in some fashion. Yeah.
Maybe I guess you misinterpreted my question.
Okay, let's have it again.
You have youth growing up in inner cities.
Right.
Of the country, and they come from the same area, they come from the same social economic conditions, they come from the same single mother housing, but a large majority of these youngsters who also are alienated, to use your word, do not join gangs and become productive members of society. So what other factors is making one group become gang members and another group become non-gang members?
Okay, I think you've just defined what, in my opinion, would be a an extremely valuable research project. And I don't have the full answer to that one, but I would strongly suspect that the ones who join the violent gang are different in terms of the alienation factor that I mentioned from those youths who do not join gangs. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. A colleague of mine at California State University, Northridge, is a man named Julian Nava, who's a very well-known professor of history. He grew up in East LA in the middle of Mexican gangs and so forth. But his family and I had a long talk with him once. He went to Harvard, got a PhD and so forth. He didn't become involved in gangs. He became the ambassador to Mexico, among other things. And what I'm saying is that I think that we need to know more about this kind of difference. And I think there is a difference. I don't think that uniformly some do haphazardly become a violent gang member and some don't. I think that in terms of, let's say, sociopathic behavior, that the individuals who don't become violent gang members somehow have someone in their family configuration. It may not, their father may not be present, but there may be an uncle or there may be somebody in the community who reaches them in some in terms of their socialization process. But I think we need to know a lot more about that. Yeah, we have this gentleman. Yeah, well, I'm going to, all right, one more, and then I'm going to get, yeah.
Okay, my second question, a major issue in Chicago was that they started to address the issue of the growing number of light gangs, light violent gang members who come from middle class, socioeconomic background, who's involved in violence. An example is the Kansas City Rockers.
You're talking about motorcycle gangs? Is that what you said?
Let me rephrase it. In Chicago, a big issue is the number of white gang members coming from middle class, socioeconomic background, who become more violent than these gangs in the inner city of Chicago. Is there any similarities or correlations that exist that's pulling these middle class kids into this violent world of gangs?
Well, I can only speculate. I don't know much or anything about those particular groups that you mentioned. But I would suspect that the rage factor, the alienation factor, and so forth would be prevalent in their social background. Because people who grow up in a reasonable, compassionate, loving, concerned family situation are not out killing people or find no particular fascination with extreme violence and gang behavior. This fellow here, yeah.
Do you believe there is a direct link between a person's mental state, mental stability, and them joining gangs? In other words, if a person's already mentally unstable and emotionally unstable, is that a major factor in them joining gangs, or is that just or does it lean more to socioeconomics?
Yeah, I see that as a factor that there are a lot of, to use a popular term, crazy guys in gangs. They do the most bizarre kinds of things. For example, an individual who has been, who's up at Pelican's Bay Prison, and who has been glorified by the press, and he wrote a book. Guy named Monster Cody, interviewed on 60 Minutes and so forth. To put it in simplistic terms, I think he admits to killing about 9 individuals. On closer appraisal, I think you'd find a screw loose somewhere there, because a guy doesn't just up and start killing people. And so I think, and I recall, for example, also in my research, a kid who really was not involved in this community, was not involved with a gang. And I said, what were you doing at the scene of, this was at the scene of a gang homicide? And he said, that night, my father kicked me out of the house. I was very upset. He threw me down the stairs. I went out to the corner, and this gang group was about to move out up to another neighborhood to get even with something. He said, I just went along with them. And he was in an emotionally distraught state. So I think that's an element of it. Now, when you get to what I call the drug gangs, where profit is involved, it's another matter. I'm not saying it's totally rational behavior, but you might put a hit on somebody who's interfering with, you're making $50,000 or $100,000 every several months, and there's some validity to it. But from my perspective, if you just sort of step back and you look at this kind of violent gang behavior, it's pure insanity. It's brother killing brother. It's guys killing their cousins and so forth. For what? There's no real comprehensible. So you have to start looking at what the inner dynamics of that individual is. Okay, one more question. I think we're concluding here. Yeah. All right. Well, okay. Well, 2, the fella, and then this lady here.
Within the last month, the state of Kansas has passed a crime reform bill, and I'm curious to know, if I'm a gang member, how much does our criminal justice system or our crime bill affect either prevention of crime or perhaps lower the severity of the crimes that are being committed? Within the gang member's mind.
You mean what effect the crime bill has?
We keep reforming our crime bills over and over, and I'm wondering, how much does that affect your mind of perhaps thinking twice before you commit crime?
Well, I would, it's a complicated question. First of all, I don't think, to my knowledge, even in prison where they have a lot of time, guys sit around and say, oh my God, in California they're passing a new crime bill. This is what am I going to do about this? Maybe I should stop committing crimes. And, the 3 strikes thing, by the way, is a matter of discussion among offenders. But the impact of a crime bill is related to what is coming out of it. Now, I'm not saying that we're saturated with law enforcement, but we have a lot of law enforcement, and more law enforcement doesn't seem to be modifying the situation at all, nor is locking people up for longer periods of time. So some of this money, and you're all in the profession now as students or working in the field, that we have to start thinking more creatively really about reaching some of these individuals and helping them to modify their behavior. This afternoon I'm going to be talking about the concept of therapeutic communities, which I think is a vital approach that's just beginning to get off the ground actually around the world, and especially here in Texas, for example, in Beaumont. There's a project where ex-addict, ex-gang members are working with offenders in a special project in the Beaumont prison. So localizing it, many of the Republicans, I'm sure there are a number of Republicans here, were attacking Jack Brooks, to focus it, for a certain amount of money for Lamar University to do a training project and to do something with this prison project. And they saw this as pork. That's nonsense. If you look closely, even midnight basketball, is not as stupid as or silly as was portrayed by many Republican advocates who were slashing at the federal crime bill, which I know a little bit more about. We have to start thinking more in the direction of some social vitamins for communities where gangs emerge. So I think crime bills are useful depending on what they're constructed to do. Okay, I think maybe I answered your question.
I was going to ask you about midnight basketball. If you thought that was worthwhile or not.
Well, in 1954, 53 to 58, when I was directing this program in New York, we had it wasn't midnight, it was 10 p.m., but it was very effective. And the families came out to watch the kids play basketball, and people got closer together. And we used to do this at Columbia University. I'll sort of end on this note. Columbia University, which was the reason they hired me was because Columbia and a lot of institutions up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan were in the middle of a crime area. So I was hired as a so-called crime prevention director. Prior to our work over a 5-year period, there was a lot of vandalism and graffiti and broken windows and so forth and so on. After about we brought these kids into the university. We integrated the situation, not in terms of race or anything like that, just people. So these kids began to perceive the university not as a place that you vandalize, and they developed some sense of ownership, that they were part of this, and all of that kind of didn't totally disappear, but a lot of the vandalism and the graffiti and so forth disappeared. And in fact, some of the kids, I'll conclude on this note, I taught criminology back there along with this program, and I brought about 5 gang kids into my class one night, and after class, it was criminology class, I said, well, what did you guys think? I said, hey man, this is easy bullshit. I can do this. They have some conception of what goes on in the college classroom far beyond what goes on in the college classroom. And somehow bringing them in, and I don't know whether any of them went on to college, but this is really what we have to start doing is integrating these kids into the social system in a more effective way. So thanks for coming, and I'll see you.